Vivek Ramaswamy is currently polling third place in the Republican primary averages, so as such, I figured I would make a video analyzing his chances against Joe Biden, since we already did the same to Nikki Haley, and of course we'll do updated videos on Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis throughout the week. So we'll take a look at Vivek Ramaswamy. Again, currently he's polling at around 7% in the overall average. He's in third place behind Ron DeSantis at around 13%, and then Donald Trump at about 58%. So, you know, a lot of these candidates realistically at this point in time have no chance at the nomination, but nonetheless, it's entertaining to sort of analyze how these candidates would do if they were put up against Joe Biden. So like in all these prediction videos, we're going to go west to east, starting off with the state of Nevada. But of course, before we begin, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. Now, Vivek's candidacy has really been centered around being more Trumpian than Trump. I mean, one of the things he has touted as his edge on Donald Trump is his age, the fact that he's much younger. But in terms of policies, he really does sort of reiterate a lot of the Trump rhetoric, and in many ways reminds me of Carrie Lake in the sense that he talks a lot about the same issues she does, and he really talks about his loyalty and devotion to Donald Trump. So in some ways, a Vivek candidacy is a lot like what we'd expect from somebody like Carrie Lake, except maybe talking about Donald Trump slightly less. But of course, if we start off in this swing state of Nevada, you know, this is a state that's been teetering on the edge for Democrats for a while. It's been moving slowly in the Republicans' column. But again, somebody like Vivek, somebody who has the Trump policies, but isn't Donald Trump. And not only that, but he doesn't have the exact appeal that Donald Trump has. Again, Vivek's appeal is mostly among very conservative online Republicans. And, you know, some sort of in the business and tech center, since he's sort of in that field, they sort of relate to him. But in a general electorate, I think Vivek Ramaswamy would have a very tough time, especially given some of the positions he's staked himself on over the course of his campaign. He's talked about a number of issues, the election. He's talked about pardoning all the defendants on January 6th. You know, 9/11 trutherism. So he has a lot of things the media has been hitting him at, and obviously that's going to hurt him in a lot of swing states like Nevada, for instance. So, you know, while Joe Biden is not a popular incumbent, what the 2022 midterms taught us is that it really doesn't matter how unpopular Joe Biden is when you run candidates that are even more unpopular or more unfavorable than him. You know, if we take a look at the state of Nevada, for instance, you know, you have the Senate race here come really close. It was about a margin of 0.8 for Catherine Cortez Masto. Of course, Republicans flipped the governorship. But when we look down ballot at some of the other races, statewide races, Attorney General, Secretary of State, this is where you had Jim Marchant, who was sort of a stop the steal Republican. He lost by one of the larger margins for a candidate this time around. So, you know, you could kind of expect Vivek Ramaswamy to do somewhat similar. Again, you sort of have the negatives of Trumpism, but without sort of the I guess positives that, you know, Trump's charisma and personal image brings. So I think Biden would probably win the state of Nevada against Vivek fairly easily. I think it'd be about a 4 to 5 point margin. Again, Ramaswamy himself is somebody who's run further to the right in the Republican primary than many voters would be comfortable with. He's run a very culture war centric campaign, and of course that's one of the downsides that Ron DeSantis has as well. He's put a lot of his campaign on culture war issues. And I think ultimately in the suburbs, that's not really going to be a winning issue, especially when issues like the economy are going to be much more at the forefront. And Ramaswamy really hasn't talked a lot about the economy. He's talked a bit about energy, but most of it has been on culture war stuff and, of course, defending Trump. So I really don't think that's going to help him in a general election. Down at Alaska. Now, Alaska is not really a true toss-up. This state obviously is sort of likely Republican. But the reason I talk about it is because it's been getting closer and closer every election cycle. You know, going back to 2012, for instance, I believe Alaska was a 16-point margin for the Republicans. In 2016, it was about a 15-point margin for Republicans. And then in 2020, it was just a 10-point margin for Republicans. And of course, we've seen the House races there. Alaska has been known to elect more moderate Democrats. Now, that doesn't mean by any stretch of the imagination that Alaska is a swing state on the presidential level, because it's certainly not. But it's not exactly a ruby red solid state either. So I think with somebody like Vivek, I think you'd probably see a high single-digit margin in Alaska, maybe somewhere between 8 to 10. Moving on up to Arizona, we sort of experimented with a Ramaswamy-type candidate in Blake Masters. Now, I will say Blake Masters, I think, wasn't as extreme as somebody like Ramaswamy. in so much as he was tying himself as closely to Trump. But, Blake Masters also sort of was all over the road when it came to his policies. And I think that's one of the other things about Ramaswamy. Ramaswamy's been on both sides of essentially every issue, and that's something that Biden's certainly going to hit him on. And it's something that certainly confuses a lot of voters. I mean, if we go back to 2020, for instance, again, going back to Blake Masters, that was one of his problems as well. He was sort of on every side of every issue. He was for something, then he was against it, then he would backpedal, then he would double down, etc. So, he ended up losing to Mark Kelly by around 5 points. Now, I don't know if the margin in Arizona would be that dramatic, but again, if Biden's winning the state of Nevada by 4 to 5 points, I think he'd do probably similarly in Arizona, which would put it pretty solidly into the lean category. Moving on down to Texas now. Ramaswamy, like Donald Trump, I think would have a big problem here in the sense that Texas would be a lot closer than it should be. And of course, you have a down ballot Senate race as well, which is certainly going to have implications for how much a potential Republican presidency could get done, and really stalling a Democratic presidency. But, looking at Texas, just like the state of Alaska, it's a solid red state that's been trending more and more in the Democrats' direction. Every year or so, I make a video on Texas. I'll probably make another video on Texas this year or maybe beginning of next year. But, you go from a 15-point margin for Romney to a 9-point margin with Donald Trump and just a 5.6 margin in 2020. So, Joe Biden is very unpopular in the state of Texas. I don't think Joe Biden would win Texas in 2024. But demographically, Texas is almost at the point where it's dangerously close to flipping for the Democrats. So I think Ramaswamy would be a much weaker candidate just because of his, rhetoric and his sort of Trumpian position. So I think you'd probably see Texas go down to about 2 points, 1.5 to 2 points. And that's probably where it's likely to be with Donald Trump as well. Again, Texas is much more of an old guard Republican state. Even more establishment Republicans like Greg Abbott have been losing ground in the state of Texas, particularly in the suburbs around Dallas, Fort Worth, and Austin. Houston is kind of sort of stagnated in its blue shift, but Dallas, Fort Worth, and Austin especially, you sort of have those technical jobs really just shifting these areas way to the left. So, I think any Republican is going to probably lose ground in the state of Texas in this current political environment. Again, I don't see Republicans really improving their margins with suburban voters in 2024, especially given the fact that a lot of Republicans aren't embracing early voting. They're not getting their voters out and to the polls before Election Day, which is something the Democrats have been masterful at doing over the past couple cycles. That is the reason why they won the 2020 election, and it's why they did much better than anticipated in 2022. So I don't think Ramaswamy would lose Texas. At this point, I don't think any of the Republicans running would lose Texas, barring maybe Donald Trump with somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene or Carrie Lake on the ticket. But, Ramaswamy would get pretty close, I think, as of right now. Moving on up to Nebraska's second, I think this would probably be likely Joe Biden again. This was a congressional district that went to Biden by 7 points. I don't see Vivek really gaining ground with any new voters. I mean, even if he did do marginally better with non-white voters, he'd probably do much worse with white voters with a college degree. And as we saw in 2020, that was really the demographic that lost the election for Trump. It was those voters, and it was actually the white working class that trended the most left out of any other voting group. So those two demographics, I don't see Vivek Ramaswamy doing particularly any better with. I mean, again, he has some of Trump's policies, but he doesn't have the image, he doesn't have the charisma. And, and in some cases, he's even more extreme on some of the more social issues that would sort of alienate these more moderate suburban voters. Up in the state of Iowa, I think Vivek would probably win Iowa. Again, going back to 2016, Iowa was a nearly 10-point margin for Donald Trump. And then in 2020, it was nearly about 8 points or so. So Iowa has been pretty comfortably in the Republican column. I think Vivek would probably lose ground, particularly in the more suburban counties, Des Moines, Cedar Rapids, the Davenport area, and he'd probably stall out a little bit in the rural areas. Again, in a matchup between Vivek and Biden, Vivek is somebody who is not really a stable figure. He's somebody, like I mentioned before, that's all over the road politically. Biden, again, by a lot of voters, he's seen as incompetent, but he's not seen as extreme by the majority of voters. Somebody like Vivek could be interpreted as that, especially with the Trump connection. That's something that Biden's certainly going to tie to him. So while I don't think Vivek is really going to do that much worse in the rural areas, I think it's going to be these suburban counties and urban counties that moves Iowa in a much more blue direction. I think probably you'd see a lean Republican Iowa with Vivek on the ticket. Moving on up to Minnesota, this would be likely Democratic. Not much to talk about here. I don't think any of the Republicans running this time around would win Minnesota. You know, if Trump in 2016 couldn't win it with vote splitting, I don't think any Republicans really going to win it at this point in time again. This really all comes down to suburbs. All of these swing states we're talking about all have suburbs that are moving leftward and have sort of made these states much more competitive than they need to be. Again, Iowa and Ohio are sort of the exceptions because the rural areas have trended so much more to the right. And in some cases, that's really the Rust Belt entirely. But when we're talking about the Sun Belt, Texas, Arizona, Nevada, these are all states that have suburban areas that were redder at one point and have since gotten bluer. So, Minnesota is one of those states where the rural areas have trended in Republicans' direction, but the suburban areas have not. And that's really the rest of the Rust Belt, because in 2016, you really saw almost the max that we've seen so far for Republicans' potential in the Rust Belt. They were able to win Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania very, very narrowly with pluralities of the vote. This time around, it's going to be a lot more difficult, especially with Joe Biden being the incumbent. And, he's really been campaigning so far on the fact that he's been able to bring manufacturing jobs to the Rust Belt. He's been talking a lot about manufacturing. He's talking a lot about job growth. And of course, those are issues that are going to resonate in the Rust Belt. So moving over to Wisconsin, again, similar thing with the state of Minnesota. Wisconsin has rural areas that are trending more and more Republican, but you do have these blue areas in the suburbs, and, the red suburbs of Milwaukee, the WOW counties as they're called, have also been trending more and more Democratic. So again, I don't really see somebody like Vivek winning back these suburbs, especially since Vivek is really staking himself in sort of the hard right lane. He's not really trying to appeal to moderates whatsoever. And that's one of the reasons why I compared him to Kari Lake earlier. He's sort of running on this strategy in the general, likely, that all he needs to do is turn out Republican voters. And in 2022, that's what really doomed Republicans, because it wasn't that they didn't turn out their own voters. It was that they turned off so many independents. And I think that's what you're going to see again and again in a lot of these states. So I think Biden would probably end up winning the state of Wisconsin by a couple of points against Vivek Ramaswamy. Again, Biden isn't popular, but he doesn't have to be that popular when he's running against somebody like Vivek, who, again, the RCP average is not doing that bad against Biden in general election polling, but he really hasn't been targeted enough by the media, and there really isn't as much attention on him as there would be if he was at the top of the ticket. Again, I would argue that Donald Trump would be a stronger candidate than Vivek, because like I said, at least Donald Trump has an established brand and isn't as all over the place with his policies as somebody like Vivek is, because he's almost starting to, again, go Trumpier than Trump and say he's going to pardon all these January 6 prisoners and whatever. And, Trump's running on that too, but I think from Vivek, it almost seems like he's sort of a sycophantic supporter. And in some ways, I think that turns off the suburbs even more than just Donald Trump himself running on the ticket. Michigan, this is probably going to be a state that Biden ends up winning by around 5 or 6 points against Vivek. Again, a lot of people would probably disagree just because of the fact that, Biden's very unpopular, but that really doesn't mean that much. Donald Trump was super unpopular both times he ran, and he won the 2016 election, and he narrowly lost 2020. So, and Michigan is one of those states where Republicans have done historically bad in recently. Again, Republicans had control of the state house and state senate in Michigan since the 1970s, or at least the state senate. It was one of the two chambers that Democrats recently flipped back in 2022. Biden won the state of Michigan by 3. And then if we go back to the 2022 midterms, thanks to, the weak candidacy of Tudor Dixon in part, the abortion referendum, Democrats did exceptionally well down ballot and were able to win a trifecta in Michigan. So, Gretchen Whitmer ends up winning re-election over Tudor Dixon by double digits. Again, Biden's not going to do nearly this well, but could he do decently well in Kent County? Absolutely. Again, in 2020, he got around 52% in Kent County, and this is an area that Donald Trump won back in 2016 pretty narrowly, so I think he would win there. I think he would improve his margins in the suburbs around Detroit. Maybe Vivek does slightly better in Wayne County, but again, it really doesn't matter. If we go back to the shifts from 2016 to 2020, Joe Biden only did 1 point better in Wayne County, so it didn't trend as far left as the rest of the state, but it doesn't matter. I think you're going to see further erosion, not just in the suburban areas, but even some of these rural areas with Vivek on the ticket. So I certainly think he's one of the more weak nominees. Ohio, same thing. Vivek's from Ohio. I don't know how much that's actually going to help him. I think he's just going to benefit from the fact that Ohio is already sort of a red state. But again, he's running on this sort of culture wars, hard right, not really trying to appeal to moderates campaign, and it's certainly not going to work in a general election. So I think he'll win Ohio. I think like Iowa, it's probably going to be in the lean category. It's going to be much closer than it actually needs to be. I think it'd even be closer than the J.D. Vance race, which is why I put it in the lean category. So you could look at maybe a 4 to 5 point margin in Ohio. And I think you'd see somebody like Vivek lose ground in northeastern Ohio, lose places like Delaware County, do worse in Montgomery County, Columbus, all of these suburban counties, and especially Hamilton as well. So he's going to lose more ground in these sort of suburban urban counties and even some of the northeastern manufacturing counties. So that would put Ohio much closer than it otherwise needs to be. Moving on up to Maine, I think Vivek could probably win the 2nd district like Donald Trump did. Again, Donald Trump was able to win the 2nd district by, I believe, around 7 points, almost 8 points. So I think Vivek would probably end up winning that by a lean margin. I could see it maybe being 4 to 5 points. And of course, Maine at large going safe to Joe Biden over 12 points. Moving on down to New Hampshire. Now, New Hampshire does have this weird tendency to sort of vote against the incumbent. We've seen this in 2004 with Bush losing New Hampshire, a state that he won in 2000. We saw it in 2012 with Romney doing better than Obama did there in 2012. And then, of course, in 2020, we saw Donald Trump lose the state by 7 points as opposed to losing it just by 0.3%. So New Hampshire is probably going to be a state where Vivek maybe does marginally better. I still think it would probably be a likely margin for the Democrats. I could see it really going either way. Maybe we break historical trends just because New Hampshire is sort of turning a bit bluer. Now, it's not turning as blue as some of these other Sunbelt states or as quickly, but you do have a lot of liberal Massachusetts voters that have been moving here over the past couple decades. One of the reasons why, New Hampshire has become bluer, but I think it would be likely Democratic nonetheless. Not too picky about the margin, though, but it's not really going to be in reach for somebody like Vivek. Pennsylvania, Vivek's going to have the same problem he had in Michigan and Wisconsin. Rural areas in Pennsylvania have trended much more Republican, but it really doesn't matter when you have areas like the Philly collar counties or Pittsburgh moving more and more left. And I really can't see somebody like Vivek winning Pennsylvania. I mean, he's not going to have the appeal he needs among the white working class in some of these swing counties, and he's going to alienate suburban voters in the Philly collar counties, but actually tend to be more left-leaning than in other suburban metros. So with that being said, I think Biden would probably end up winning Pennsylvania by 5. I actually think it would be one of his better states. Again, somebody like Trump, I think, would do better in Pennsylvania because at least he'd be able to keep the margins very high in these rural counties. But, somebody like Vivek in a lot of cases is even more fringe than Donald Trump, and I think would even alienate some of these more rural voters that might break slightly more in favor of Biden just because of the economic messaging or the fact that he's the incumbent. Again, there could be other issues on the ballot in 2024. And we really haven't seen the impacts of the overturning of Roe v. Wade on a presidential level. We've seen it in the midterm level. We've seen it in a lot of special elections. We might see it next month with the Virginia races. But, on a presidential level, we really haven't seen how potent abortion could actually be. So that's something I might be under talking about because it's been a massive issue in the midterms, massive issue in this year's elections, and it's probably going to be a big issue in 2024. And as you can expect, Vivek's probably not the most moderate on the abortion issue. That's certainly not going to help him with sort of those suburban moderate voters. Again, if we go back to 2022, for instance, and again, not to compare Vivek to Doug Mastriano, but when we did have a candidate running hard right on abortion, pro-life, no exceptions, this is what you get in Pennsylvania. You get a 15-point margin effectively, and you're losing safe red counties in a lot of instances. Luzerne County was essentially a safe red county in 2020, ended up almost flipping Westmoreland County. That's a safe red county. Beaver County, red county. So a lot of these counties that really should be Lancaster County almost flipping. So all of these areas, even safe red counties are put in jeopardy with bad abortion messaging in the Midwest. Perhaps that's something being under talked about. But I think Vivek's margin would ultimately be a lot similar to what we saw with Fetterman versus Oz in that, out of the 3 pivot counties, Luzerne, Northampton, and Erie, those are the counties that went from Obama to Trump. He probably holds on to Luzerne, ends up losing the other 2, and, does a bit worse in the rural areas overall. So that's where I see Pennsylvania going. Down to Virginia, safe Biden. I think you're probably going to see an even worse performance than Trump 2020 in Virginia with somebody like Vivek, especially in the Northern Virginia suburbs. The Richmond suburbs, even Virginia Beach. These voters are somewhat more persuadable with a more mainstream Republican, somebody like Glenn Youngkin. That's one of the reasons why he was able to win. He was able to chip away at Democrats' margins here. But somebody like Vivek, he's going to do horrible in Nova, especially since he's sort of running on purging the federal government, which is something Trump's running on too. But again, Vivek is just seen as more of a fringe candidate. And he's certainly going to be just total kryptonite in these Northern Virginia suburbs. So you're probably going to see Fairfax County go over 70% Democrat, and you're probably going to see Prince William and Loudoun County go into the mid-60s. And, you know, Chesterfield obviously going comfortably Democratic, Virginia Beach, Chesapeake going comfortably Democratic. You could even see Spotsylvania County get close to flipping. Lynchburg City probably going lean Democrat. So he's just going to get a lot worse there. It's going to be over a 12-point margin for the Democrats. North Carolina, again, if Vivek is doing this bad nationwide, he's probably not winning the state of North Carolina. North Carolina would still be incredibly close just because of the nature of the state. But I still think it would go to Biden incredibly narrowly. Again, all you would need for Vivek to lose the state of North Carolina is for Joe Biden to do slightly better in Wake County, Charlotte County, and all else being equal around the state. So it could be an even worse picture for Vivek if most of the state's counties end up trending left. But all you really need is these urban counties to trend more in the Democrats' direction, places like New Hanover County. That's all you really need. Again, Donald Trump only won North Carolina by about a point, so it's really not out of the realm of possibility for him to lose very narrowly, and I think somebody like Vivek probably would lose narrowly. South Carolina, I think, would probably be likely Republican. I don't think Vivek would do that much worse than Donald Trump here. I think he'd probably win the state by around 10. He'd certainly do worse in Charleston, probably get maybe 40% of the vote in Charleston County. Do worse in places like York County, Chester County, Greenville, these counties that Trump got over 60% back in 2016, but actually ended up only getting in the high 50s. I think Vivek would probably erode support there. But South Carolina is one of those states where Republicans are just benefiting from the fact that there's a lot of red-leaning voters moving down here. So that's really why I don't think the margin would be all that different than Trump 2020. Because a lot of these voters are not your typical Midwestern, Sunbelt, moderate suburbanites. You do have those in Charleston, but most of these are true red Republican voters that are moving from the Northeast that are going to vote Republican no matter what. So I think, you know, Vivek would probably win that by around 10 points. I don't think he'd do too much worse. Georgia, similar story to North Carolina. I think it's going to go blue in this scenario. Again, Vivek would be toxic to the Atlanta suburbs. You know, somebody like Herschel Walker did very poorly there. Now, Vivek is certainly a better public speaker than somebody like Herschel Walker, potentially has less scandals. But, you know, I didn't even talk about the big pharma scandals with Vivek that would probably hurt him in a lot of these Rust Belt and swing states in general. But that's certainly something that could bite him in Georgia. Going back to Georgia in 2020, this was an incredibly narrow loss for Donald Trump. He only lost here by about 0.2. It was the closest state in 2020. Again, 11,000 votes. That's what, you know, was talked about in that phone call that went very viral between Trump and Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger. But again, the Atlanta suburbs are already an area that are zooming left demographically. Demographics are becoming nearly impossible for Republicans to win Georgia. They could probably still win statewide here for the duration of the decade. But after that, again, unless there's massive demographic shifts or Republicans are doing significantly better with Black and Latino voters, and Asian voters, you're not going to see really much of a swing back in favor of the Republicans. So I think somebody like Vivek would probably lose here by around 2-3. Again, Georgia is a very racially polarized state. So, you know, white voters tend to vote Republican here around 70-30, and non-white voters tend to vote Democrat about 70-30. So that's a very, very stable number. And, you know, that's why one of the reasons why Georgia's always been so close over the past decade or so. It's because the state is just so incredibly polarized, and you have turnout among non-white voters almost matching the numbers they need to flip the state essentially every time. So the real swing demographic in Georgia is white suburban voters in the Atlanta suburbs who are highly educated, and I don't think Vivek would do very good with that demographic. Moving on down to Florida. Again, Florida is a very, very red state now. Again, I wouldn't say it's a safe red state. Just because DeSantis won this state by 20 points doesn't mean Florida is safe red for Republicans. You know, Democrats could certainly end up winning this state in a cycle or two. It just really depends on strategy. I just don't think Democrats are going to put a lot of money in the state of Florida, especially when in this scenario, they should be putting a lot more money in North Carolina, the Rust Belt, Arizona, Nevada. I think Florida is going to be largely ignored, similar to Ohio and Iowa. I don't think Democrats are going to put much attention there. So I think Republicans can win here. I think Vivek would do pretty poorly here, though. I think it'd probably end up being a tilt margin. Just because of the fact that he's not Ron DeSantis, he's not Donald Trump. Again, generic Republicans can do well here, but he's, again, a certain sort of fringe type Republican that I don't think would do that well in the suburban counties. Again, look at 2020 Florida, would do worse in the Orlando area, would do worse in Miami-Dade likely than Donald Trump. He doesn't have the same appeal as Donald Trump. Would do worse in Tampa Bay. I think he'd do worse overall than Donald Trump in the state of Florida. So, Vivek would be one of the rare candidates that I think would actually underperform Trump 2020 in the state of Florida. I don't even think Donald Trump would underperform his 2020 numbers in Florida at this point in time. But anyway, this is how I think a Vivek-Biden matchup would probably work out. Again, some of the tilt states, I guess you could say, arguably could go either way, although, seeing Texas and Florida go blue would be incredibly shocking. I don't know if we'll see that in 2024, but again, this scenario is very unlikely since Vivek Ramaswamy is pulling third place, as I mentioned. But I figured if we're going to talk about Nikki Haley versus Biden, we might as well do Vivek, DeSantis, and Trump as well. So anyway, that's it for today's video. If you enjoyed, leave a like down below. If you haven't subscribed, subscribe down below. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.